Hello, welcome to my channel, Anglican Aesthetics. I'm really excited about this interview here. I have with me Dr. Jason Staples, and we're going to talk a little bit about his book, Paul and the Resurrection of Israel. I think it's one of those books that comes around every once in a while, like Paul and the Gift, that just makes a huge impact in New Testament studies. So before we dive in, Dr. Staples, do you want to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your own ministry and academic context?
I don't know. I don't know how much I could go with on this. I'm at NC State University as a thriving adjunct professor at NC State University. I did my PhD at UNC Chapel Hill, supervised by Bart Ehrman, actually.
Hmm.
Um, who was a joy to work with for what it's worth. I always
Hmm.
get those questions, but he was really pleasant to work with. Um, and then did my BA and my MA at Florida State before that, where did focused on a lot of language work at the time and did a lot of work in their classics department, which is really good and was really helpful for me.
Hmm.
Um, and then beyond that, have lots of other jobs. So I've been doing sports media coverage for what almost 20 years now.
Wow. Wow.
And then and have a couple different gigs on that, and have had quite a few over the years. And then do some voice work and editing and other things. So
Hmm.
yeah, and then the two books that took me 20 years to get out, and now I'm working on several other projects that hopefully I can get out within the next couple of years.
Wow. Wow. So it sounds like you stay really busy. That's great. So yeah, tell us a little bit about what drew your interest in writing about Paul and Israel. What was the sort of thinking that led up to this book?
Yeah, it's a good question. Um, so I mean, I could answer it like five different ways. I think the probably simplest way to talk about it is that when I was a junior in undergrad at Florida State, I took a class on the Hebrew Bible prophets that wound up being really formative for me. One of the reasons was that we, we went pretty deeply in that. Actually, three of us went on to PhD work in the field from that undergrad survey class.
Hmm.
Actually, Nicole Tilford, who's now part of SBL Press, and she did
Hmm.
her PhD under Carol Newsom at Emory. She was in that class. Chris Hooker, who many SBL members, Society of Biblical Literature members, know for his work in the tech side of SBL stuff. He went on to do his PhD work under Seau at Princeton Theological Seminary
Hmm.
on the Hebrew Bible stuff, and then I went on as well to UNC. So we dug pretty deeply in that class, and really what happened is it occurred to me. I was reading through and I've got it back on my shelf somewhere there. Through one of the books that we had for that was the one of the Exploring the Old Testament series from Varsity Press, Conville on the prophets.
Hmm.
And there were a couple points where he made some observations about Jeremiah and Second Isaiah, and a few of these prophets who are writing after the fall, after the destruction of the Northern Kingdom, after large portions of the Northern Kingdom had gone into exile and so on. And he noted that Jeremiah, for example, prophesies restoration to the house of Israel and the house of Judah.
Hmm.
And he pointed out that, like, that's kind of odd given that the house of Israel had basically, that kingdom had disappeared almost 150 years earlier. So
Hmm.
he just left an open question of, well, it's difficult to establish what Jeremiah means here. And he did a
Yeah.
similar thing with Second Isaiah, Isaiah 40 through 56-ish,
Yeah.
talking about the same problem that, Isaiah is talking about Israel, but this is in the wake of even the Babylonian exile. Who exactly is Israel in this context? And I remember him asking that question, and it stood out to me as, well, that's interesting. And ultimately, I decided to write on that for the semester, and I determined, I came to the conclusion that that I was not satisfied with any of the with any of the scholarly answers that I saw in the literature as I was
Hmm.
digging through. And I thought there was actually a clearer solution than that, for at least how the New Testament took it. And I wanted to see, where that went in early Judaism and so on. So that sort of started the whole process. That was back in
Hmm.
2003.
Wow.
And then basically by about 2006, I was convinced that I had a solution that worked across early Judaism and into the New Testament, and thought, well, do a PhD, knock this out in 5, 6 years, and then move on with my life, and make a big contribution here, something that I think is worthwhile. And 20 years later, I finally got those two books out. It took a lot longer and a lot more work than I had anticipated on the front end, but a lot of it was that. Now,
Yeah.
there are all sorts of other things that, if you got deep into my psyche in terms of psychology and all of that, and my background, from how I was raised and all of that. I mean, I was raised reading the Bible closely,
Hmm.
and at the same point raised to essentially call into question anything that was ever spoken in any church about what the text meant, and to
Hmm.
really focus on what the text said, whether I liked it or not, and whether it was what I was told that it meant or not, and really, spend some time sitting with it, and all of that. And that was a really important part of my upbringing. Um, and beyond that, I was raised, my dad's insistence, as I was raised throughout when I was younger, throughout my childhood, was the Old Testament is the Bible. The New
Hmm.
Testament, tells you how to read it, but everything's already there in the Old
Oh,
Testament. My
interesting.
dad would say that sort of thing all the time, and
Oh,
actually he used to say, it's all in Genesis. Everything's in Genesis. So
huh.
so, you know, I I grew up really spending a lot of time in the Hebrew Bible, in the
Hmm.
Old Testament, in the Christian Old Testament, which I think is unusual for a lot of people in New Testament studies. I'm regularly surprised by how, I mean, for the lack of a better word, ignorant many of my fellow New Testamenters are on uh, on the Old Testament, on the Torah, on Hebrew
Hmm.
Bible stuff, and that's where I spent so much of my time. And then when I started my master's work at Florida State and all that, spent a lot of time in the Dead Sea Scrolls and other early Jewish literature. So really, my area was much more coming out of Hebrew Bible and early Judaism, and then working and seeing that as the uh, the ocean that Paul is swimming in, and is,
Hmm.
in the air that he's breathing, uh, and then working on Paul from that angle. I think that's turned out to be a pretty big advantage. But in that sense, in some ways, I am a Paul specialist. I mean, I've written a book on Paul,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, I'm sort of a Paul specialist who does Paul as, from an angle of sort of a non-traditional way of thinking about Paul. Like
Yeah.
I was not trained to be a Paul person. I was trained in, Hebrew Bible, early Judaism, to some extent in the New Testament as well, and then actually early Christianity as well, because working with Ehrman, you're going to do a lot of that
Hmm.
as well. So I sort of worked on everything around Paul, and then ended up doing a book on Paul at the
Yeah.
end of it, which I kind of knew I was going to go that direction from 2003 on, but it ended up being, all of those things kind of coalesced into this larger thing.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, and that's helpful context for the book. That it sounds like as you were growing up, you were sort of taught to see the Old Testament really as the Bible, and the New Testament as that which explains the Old. How would that interact with the sort of Augustinian idea that, the Old Testament is the New Testament hidden, the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed?
I think, as much as it pains me to admit Augustine got anything right, um, I think it's very much part and parcel of that very idea.
Yeah.
That's very close to kind of how I was raised to see things, is
Hmm.
uh, that the the Hebrew Bible, the the Old Testament is where all the promises are made, all, basically the entire stage is set, and finally you get, kind of the last act to explain, to put the last pieces in place in the New Testament in in some surprising ways. But basically that was how I was raised to think.
Hmm.
And to a certain extent, there's no escaping there's no escaping were trained.
Yeah, that's right.
And
Yeah.
so that gave me specific lenses through which to see a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, so let's talk a little bit then about ways of viewing Israel. First, how were you growing up raised to see the relationship between the church and Israel, and how would you sort of sketch the landscape of views that are out there right now in New Testament scholarship of relating the church and Israel?
Yeah, so I got to see a lot of different angles on this because of some of the schooling background and other things that I had. So just to put it in perspective, due to some fairly poor uh, school options that I had early on. So first of all, I was homeschooled through a good portion of my grade school. And then when I went to middle school, due to some really poor options where I was, my parents sent me to a independent fundamentalist Baptist middle school,
Whoa.
which was
Huh.
really more for the academics. We were not independent fundamentalist Baptists. We
Hmm.
weren't Baptists. We weren't fundamentalists. We were pretty independent, but that was about as far as it went.
Yeah.
Um, but I was the troublesome student there as a seventh and eighth grader who made the Bible teacher at that school his hair stand on end when I explained to him that the Bible was not in fact the Word of God, that Jesus
Hmm.
is the Word of God according to the Bible, and if we want to read the Bible carefully, we should take it, we should take it at its word there,
Hmm.
and not assign to it titles that it doesn't assign to itself.
Hmm.
So, I was an outsider there, but at that kind of
That as a
school,
seventh grader. That's
yeah,
awesome.
yeah. Well, I mean, this came after I'd put a Bible on the floor at some point.
Yeah.
It was like,
Wow.
we don't do
Huh.
that. Like, that's the word of God. I was like, no, it's not.
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
what do you mean you don't believe? No, according to the Bible, Jesus is the word of God.
Hmm.
Well, true, but
Sounds
so
very Bardian. Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, so in that context, I got to see a lot of dispensationalist kind of approaches,
Mm.
where you had a notion of a division between the church and basically you had. Actually, I should step back, because there are different options here. The historic Christian theological option is some version of the church, the ecclesia,
Hmm.
is the fulfillment of the eschatological promises to restored Israel. That in
Yeah.
some sense, uh, what you see as the church, meaning the people who follow Jesus uh, and have the Holy Spirit, are are Israel in
Hmm.
in this sense, and that includes Jews, Gentiles, anyone who has the Spirit and is walking by the Spirit is included in Israel.
Yeah.
So you get that. That's a pretty standard line, and there's a variety of different ways of taking that. I mean, you've had a historical one historical approach has been to think of it as a replacement, that essentially you have a Gentile church that replaces uh, disobedient Jews as the
Right.
people of Israel.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's a replacement theology or supersessionism of some sort.
Yeah.
Uh, that's that's one common view. Out
Hmm.
of that view, actually, I think actually dispensationalism grows out of that idea
Hmm.
of a replacement where you have the Jews were Israel and then they were replaced by the church,
Hmm.
and now the church is Israel. You have that idea.
Hmm.
Uh, what happens, around the 19th century is you start to get a reaction against that by some people, dispensationalists, popularized by John Nelson Darby and
Hmm.
others. And this is where you get, you got a lot of the influence at that IFB school that I went to.
Yeah.
Um, and you get this emphasis that no, God never replaces the Jews as Israel. Instead, the church is something different. They're both the people of God, but you have like two peoples of God. You have the Jews are still Israel, but then the church is sort of Israel. It's like spiritual Israel and fleshly Israel, and they're each Israel,
Yeah.
but the church not really Israel in the same way. So you have that notion, and then uh, beyond that, you have some other sort of derivations or iterations that get a little, a little further away or a little closer to each. Um, and I wound up concluding that neither of those, neither the replacement nor the dispensational option really works.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of where I went on this. But I saw that. I also saw more of the traditional Christian angle on this. I went to a Catholic high school.
Mm.
So I went from an IFB middle school for seventh and eighth grade to an all boys Catholic high school.
Wow.
And the IFB school was a rural, out in the middle of the sticks kind of school. The Catholic school was an urban school. So you talk about vertigo going from one to the other.
Yeah.
But then, at the Catholic school, I gained some level of, familiarity with uh, early church traditions as well as a part
Mm.
of that training as well. So, and I was an outsider to both. I was neither Catholic nor independent fundamentalist Baptist nor Baptist period. So, uh, got to see all of that from different angles.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's great. And your view, as I was reading your book, it did strike me as it's neither replacement theology nor dispensationalism. It seems to have affinities with this fulfillment idea, but in a unique way. So, as far as I saw it, you seem to argue that Israel is sort of a wider category, and you have the Jews as part of that, Judahite, which comes from that word Judahites, to talk about the southern kingdom. But Israel itself, in the restoration of Israel, is then restored to, as it were, sweep in the Gentiles. But that's part of the larger project of God also restoring the northern kingdom, which I thought
Right.
was a really interesting approach. So, can you explain a little bit of the logic of that and how, as I understood it, Romans 9 functions into that reading of the restoration of Israel?
Well, you summed it up really well, actually, yourself. I mean, that's a really elegant way to summarize it. But the basic idea is that essentially within Scripture, Israel, first of all, refers to the patriarch, right? The patriarch
Hmm.
Israel, that is Jacob. And
Hmm.
he's named Israel by the one that he wrestles, who says, "No longer will you be called Jacob, but you will be called Israel, because you have striven, or you've wrestled, or struggled uh, with God and with humans, and have overcome."
Yeah.
And so you have that, and then his descendants, his sons, become the children of Israel, right?
Yeah.
And they become a people, eventually a nation, and you have the 12 tribe people of Israel. Now,
Mm.
the thing is, that nation splits. That nation, you have one part secedes from the other. This is the biblical narrative, right? You have
Well,
the one part.
sorry about that.
No, it's
It's an
fine.
alarm on my phone.
It is now 10:15. Do you know where your children are? So uh, for those of you who are a little on the younger side, that message used to come up on the screen because, well, Gen Xers and Gen Xers raised by Boomer parents, well, the Boomer parents often didn't know where their children were. So as
Oh,
opposed to today, where everybody's tracked. So
yeah, yeah, Jonathan Haidt. Anyway, yeah,
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 exactly.
yeah.
So anyway, uh, the the 12 tribes of Israel, this becomes an important biblical theme of the whole people. And that whole people of Israel splits into two kingdoms, one of which keeps the name Israel, that is the northern kingdom of Israel. And
Mm.
then the southern kingdom goes by the name of the largest tribe, which controls virtually all of that territory, and that's the kingdom of Judah. Now, what that means is that, for the period of the two kingdoms, you have Israelites who are Israelites, and then you've got Israelites who are not actually part of the kingdom of Israel, but rather the part of the kingdom of Judah. And
Yeah,
both are part of larger Israel, but there's a difference between like the nation of Israel and larger Israel in the covenantal sense.
yeah,
Uh, that northern kingdom of Israel is ultimately destroyed by the Assyrian Empire, and many of the people from there, according to the biblical record, also according to the record of the Assyrians themselves, many of those people are exiled or deported into different places, And then some other people are brought into the land to kind of, as a part of deportations from elsewhere and all that. But it's another issue. Uh, so at that point, you have the kingdom of Judah that remains, and the remnant of the small remnant of the people of Israel are, there's still some in the land. Some actually took refuge south. They went south and became sort of integrated and assimilated among the kingdom of Judah.
Mm.
Eventually, Judah is also they are defeated by the Babylonians and go into exile and so on. But here's the kicker: the people from Judah have a specific word that refers to their ethnic identification, and that is they are Jews. Jew comes from Judah, or Yehudim from, this is the Hebrew word for Jews. Uh, Yehudim comes from Yehudah, which
Yeah.
is the name of the tribe and also the name of the land of the tribe. And so the kicker here, and this is one of the more important pieces to sort of understand, and this opens up a lot in the Bible, not just in the New Testament and understanding Paul, but understanding the Hebrew Bible as well. Uh, Basically, those who are Jews are only from that only represents a portion of the larger covenantal people of Israel, who are not all from the tribe of Judah or the people associated with that tribe and its rule of Judah or Jerusalem and so on. You have non-Jewish Israelites from places like Reuben or tribes like Reuben or Dan or whatever. These are non-Jews, but they're Israelites, part of the larger Israelite group. And this understanding continues throughout the the Second Temple period, basically after the Babylonian exile of Jews, remains a widely understood and widely pained distinction. Because you have the biblical record. You have people who this is
Mm.
their sort of ethnic charter. This is who we are as a people. And we are Jews.
Yeah.
And it's talking about Israelites who are not us.
Yeah.
But we also
Yep.
are Israelites, but we're Jews, right? We're
Yep.
the Jewish part of Israel. So this is understood. So then when we get to Paul, Paul is actually having to explain something difficult in Romans 9 to 11, and that's that he has been prophesying, or he's been claiming that the prophets, the prophecies of the prophets are being fulfilled in and through the work of Jesus and the Holy Spirit that is granted to those who follow Jesus.
Yeah.
So if Jesus is the promised Messiah and the Holy Spirit that is promised by the prophets to accompany the restoration of Israel, well, as Desi Arnaz used to say, you got some splaining to do at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Yep.
the real issue is the Spirit. We know about the Spirit from he spends a lot of time on it in the New
Yeah.
Testament, but the Spirit in this context is a promise made by the prophets explicitly to Israel as a part of Israel's future restoration.
Yeah.
So in Ezekiel 36, God says, I will give you a new heart and a new spirit so that you will finally do the things that I require. You will keep my laws and my statutes, which you have not kept previously. And then this is part of the restoration that is promised to the whole people of Israel. And the
Yeah.
reason for this is simple. The reason that in the biblical literature and in the prophets, the reason that Israel goes into exile, the reason that they're deported, that they're scattered, that there's this whole thing that happens is because they disobeyed the covenant.
Yeah.
The covenant promises blessing to Israel so long as they adhere to the basic principles of the covenant. And the basic command is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, right? So
Right.
that is the basic command of the Torah in Deuteronomy 6.
Yeah.
Well, the problem is the people end up not loving the Lord. You know, you go to Exodus, what's the first thing that they do when Moses goes up the
Yeah.
mountain?
Yeah. They build the
Very
idol.
shortly thereafter, they are
Yeah.
making idols, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're breaking the covenant while he's getting the covenant.
Yeah. Yeah.
So and throughout the history of Israel, this is happening. And so by the time we get to these later prophets, they're saying, okay, the curses of the covenant are going to come upon us.
Mm.
God is going to scatter you, but God will restore and redeem and restore you at some time in the future. Now, here's the problem. If God brings them back to the land, but doesn't fix the thing that led them to go, that caused the exile in the first place, what's going to be the outcome? Rinse and repeat, right?
Hmm.
So, what the prophets promise is God isn't just going to bring you back in a physical sense, He's going to change your hearts so that you actually love Him and live. This is the
Yeah.
wording of Deuteronomy 30, verse 6. The Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed so that you will love Him and live.
Yeah.
So, this is the promise. But this is all having to do with the promise to the people of Israel.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, Paul's just spent 8 chapters in Romans saying, hey guys, this is happening. The
Yeah.
Spirit's here.
Yeah.
What we were, Romans 8 begins, for what the law, what the Torah could not do because it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending His Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and so He condemned sin and sinful humanity. And now, those of us who walk by the Spirit are actually children of God, right?
Yeah.
We have the Spirit, like the Spirit that was promised in Ezekiel and in Deuteronomy and in Jeremiah. This has happened.
Yeah.
And of course, the next thing is you got some splaining to do because how does this apply to Gentiles? Why are
Right.
we seeing with this with Gentiles, and where are the other tribes? Why are we
Yeah.
not seeing the promised restoration? So now
Yep.
Romans 9 to 11 comes in and says, okay, well, here's the thing. We got to talk about Israel here. And what happened to Israel? First of all, not all who are from Israel are Israel, he
Right.
says. So some people disobey. If you disobey the covenant, you may be cut off. You may not be
Yep.
included within the promises of Israel.
Yeah.
But even beyond that, what happens to the rest of Israel? Well, even the disobedient part that's cut off, what does God do with them? Well, He makes a promise that they're going to be restored, but in what form? So ultimately, and this is my case in the book, is Paul makes the case that God essentially not being able to use Israel's obedience to achieve His purposes finds a way to work with Israel's disobedience to
Hmm.
accomplish His purposes for the whole world.
Yeah.
And he explicitly sets Israel up as to be a light to the nations, to be a kingdom of priests, and all of this. When they disobey, they are then scattered among the nations.
Yeah.
And what we find is the first of the writing prophets, one of the 2 first writing prophets is Hosea.
Mm.
Amos is probably a little earlier, but Hosea is the one that goes to the northern kingdom of Israel and says, "You guys, you are not my people," God says, "and I am not your God." This is a way of dissolving the covenant. This is what Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 3 talks about God giving Israel a writ of divorce and
Yeah.
sending them away. So they are divorced. Well, the thing is, previously they were the people of God. They were Israel. They were
Yeah.
separated from all the other nations. You will be my people and I will be your God. They are essentially they take on His name.
Yeah.
Now they're not that. Now they are not my people. What Paul does is he reads this and he says, what does not my people mean? I mean, who are the not my people? If you
Hmm.
have if you have Israel is my people, who are not my people. Not my people would be Gentiles.
Yeah.
And then this is the move that he makes at the end of Romans 9 is he says, don't we see that God has done all this so that he has called vessels not only from Jews but also from Gentiles, as it is written,
Mm. Right.
I will call those who are not my people my people. Paul knows
Yeah.
full well that that's a promise to the northern kingdom, but he
Yeah.
also knows that Hosea promised that the northern kingdom would be not my people.
Yeah. Yep.
And so he is looking at this 8 centuries later, and 8 centuries is a long time.
Yeah.
He's looking at this and saying, look, what happened to these people? Read 2 Kings 17. You
Yep.
have intermarriage even within the land.
Yep.
Where did the tribe of Reuben go? Where did Naphtali go? Where did,
Yeah.
these various tribes go? And he goes, guys, they became not my people.
Yeah.
And now
Yep.
not my people is coming in.
Yep. Yep.
So that then becomes the move that he makes, and where he says, this is about the salvation, and this is the final verse of the argument, really, in Romans. Well, not the final verse, but the final real statement of the argument in Romans 11 is they become all. This is about the salvation of all Israel, not just Jews, not
Yeah.
just the part that you can see, but rather how is God going to reach beyond the grave, beyond the death of the ethnic death of the people, to restore the people to whom he made promises? How's he
Yep.
going to do that?
Yep.
And he says, God is actually showing faithfulness to the people of Israel, even to the point of gathering them from the very nations where they were scattered and where they essentially disappeared. They were assimilated. So
Yeah.
now, because Israel became assimilated among those nations, God is just saying, bring the nations in.
Yeah.
And in
That's
so
great.
doing, he's
Yeah.
making the move to do exactly what he promised and bringing Israel in. And now Israel
Yeah.
among the nations is being engrafted into the tree, and the tree itself is all Israel. This is the olive tree in Romans 11. The tree is all Israel. The engrafting process is the way that God is expanding, essentially bringing people into the people of Israel and renewing Israel from in a very surprising way.
Yeah.
And the end result is his promises to Israel are fulfilled, and the very design for which he selected Israel to begin with. That is to
Yeah.
be a light to the nations and to bring justice and mercy to the whole world is actually accomplished all in one move. And that's
Yeah.
the elegance of what he actually argues, that the salvation of all Israel is actually bigger, more sweeping, and more elegant than what you would anticipate if you just expect return to the land of a few people. It's
Yeah.
much
That's
bigger than
great.
that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think elegant is a really good word to use there because it shows that St. Paul's actually seeing scripture as more cohesive than actually we possibly could have imagined. So let me summarize and see if this is right. What you're seeing Paul is doing, because a lot of, as you know, like a lot of people say, yeah, Paul's just basically abusing Hosea, which I think is kind of lazy, like a lazy way to read Paul. But what you're saying is no, he's not abusing Isaiah or Hosea rather, but rather what's happening is that the Northern Kingdom became part of that category, not my people, and that was always denoted by Gentiles. Like that's what that
Right.
word Gentiles
They
means.
didn't
Hmm.
have that word in the time of Hosea,
Right,
right?
right,
Gentile, the use of Gentile to mean not part of the covenant people, that's a much later thing. Actually, even as early as late as Paul, that's not the way that that word tends to be used.
yeah,
So when he's looking at this, he's like, not my people means like the non-covenantal people. Who are those
right.
people? It's them.
Right. Yep, yep. And they become now part of not my people, part of the Gentiles. And so in order to restore not my people, God brings in the Gentiles because the northern kingdom has actually become enmeshed into not my people,
Right,
i.e. the
right.
Gentiles.
Yeah,
And that's
exactly.
great. And that, I think one of the elegant things about that reading is that actually explains a lot about how Paul would have been reading texts like in Isaiah 11 through 14, where the Lord talks about calling his people back from Egypt or from Elam or from these different places. And somehow these places then bring the Egyptians along with them, it seems. They possess the nations. And so there's a way of reading the possession of the nations as being fulfilled in God restoring and re-engrafting the Gentiles, the not my people, back into Israel. How would that? Yeah, how does that seem as a kind of summary?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, I struggled with a way to try to put this in the book to explain how, to say, uh, I'm going to take people from the crowd
Yeah.
can mean two different things, right? Or another way to put it is, I'm going to, you could say, okay, so let's say that could imply that you have a crowd of animals and people, and you're
Hmm.
just going to take the people who are separate from the animals, and you're going to take the people from the mixed crowd.
Yeah.
Or it could mean you're going to take the whole crowd is made up of people, and you're going to take people
Yep.
from the crowd. So that
Yeah.
means that some of the crowd is going to be taken and brought in.
Yep.
Those are two different things. So
Yeah.
this is where, the flexibility of this, you can read the prophets two different ways as a result. When it says that God is going to restore his people from the nations
Yeah.
where they were scattered, that can mean that you have sort of like a tossed salad,
Yeah.
right? Where you have walnuts that are in the salad,
Yeah.
and you're going to take the walnuts out of the salad.
Yeah.
That's one way of doing it. That's one
Hmm.
way of talking about this. That would be taking his people from the nations where
Right.
they are, because his people are separate from the nations. The nations
Yep.
are the rest, right? But it's a completely different thing if we're talking about a melting pot kind of approach
Yes.
or a soup,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
now I'm going to take you from the nations where you've been scattered.
Yeah.
And so now what happens is you just take spoonfuls of the soup
Yeah.
and you're in there.
Yep.
You're so now I'm going to take from the soup. Well,
Yep.
what are you taking from the soup? You're taking soup.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And so there's a difference between those two things. And what ultimately we find is that Paul, and then ultimately that moves just Christian theology in this direction, although I think largely later Christian theology sort of loses the the foundation on which Paul's actually building here. It's one of those things that's not really emphasized or even remembered in many cases because it's no longer at issue.
Yep.
By the
Yep.
time you get later, it's like, well, of course we're heirs to Israel. Move on.
Yep.
There's not a whole lot of explanation to. There's not a whole lot of effort to explain how that you get from point A to point B in this. All the matter,
Yeah.
okay, we're going to start from point B and move on. And that's what you get in later Christian theology. And it leads to some really nasty replacement theology and a
Right.
lot of things that are, beyond regrettable, some
Yeah.
real tragic things in church history and just world history.
Yeah.
But Paul's explanation is it's more like the soup.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Yep.
so God is going to be faithful to the pieces of Israel that wound up in that soup. And he's going to restore Israel. And Israel's in that soup. So now the soup's going to get spooned out.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's something like that.
Yeah. That's really helpful. So there are two questions that emerge there because in that paradigm, God, it's almost as though actually, so this is less of a question and more more of just a way of thinking about it. It's almost as though in recalling the sort of Northern Kingdom, you can sort of almost think of it as a magnet. And like in recalling those people, God's also drawing those into whom they have been enmeshed.
Yeah.
And
Once you
therefore,
get sufficient iron content in there and you start to pull at the iron, whatever it's alloyed with is also coming with
yeah,
it,
yep,
right?
yep, yep, yeah, 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 yeah. So that's really helpful. One potential, and so one thing as I was thinking through, okay, how would someone maybe object to that thesis? Because it is a very compelling reading of Romans 9. The thing that comes to mind is Romans 2 and 3. So in Romans 3, where St. Paul says that the Jews are entrusted with the oracles of God, one could say, well, he's using that as a synodoke for Israel. And then in Romans 2, where St. Paul seems to talk about the true Jew is the one who, so, he talks about the Jew that's
Hmm.
only a Jew outwardly, and the true Jew is the one who keeps the commands, and will not their uncircumcision be reckoned as circumcision. And one could argue there that St. Paul is then identifying even these Gentiles as true Jews. How would your view interact with Romans 2?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's actually one of the harder parts to address on
Hmm.
this. I think one of the most difficult parts. My take there is, first of all, his argument is primarily in Romans 2. It's primarily to argue that those who do not follow the law, but continue to identify themselves and be identified as Jews, are actually not. So this they would qualify as the people that in Romans 9 are from Israel, but they're not Israel,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So that's the bulk of his argument there is God is going to judge justly,
Yeah.
and those who are the one who is a the one who is a Jew uh, inwardly in a
Yeah.
hidden fashion, right? So uh, my reading of that is that in that context, and whereas if they are not inwardly, then regardless of what their body shows on the outside, they're not in fact counted by God as
Mm.
Jewish.
Yeah.
So that's essentially the case that he makes is he says, you know, their behavior, their keeping of the covenant is going to determine whether or not they count to God as Jews. What he doesn't actually say in those verses, he does say that the one who's uncircumcised physically, if he keeps if he does the dikaiomata to nomu,
Yeah. The
the
righteous
the
judgments
just
of God.
things of the
Yeah. Yeah.
Torah, if he does justice, then will not his or then his foreskin will be reckoned, will be treated as though it were a circumcision. What
Yeah.
he doesn't actually say in that context is that that person becomes Jewish.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah.
So my reading of that is that the Jewish person that he's referring to as the one who is a Jew inwardly is someone who is circumcised, and then that person's Jewishness is confirmed by their inward Jewishness, as it were, obedience. Whereas the
Mm.
uncircumcised individual, we find out later, isn't actually technically Jewish, but is included within Israel. So
Yeah.
that's my reading of it. It's a really tight parsing, and I think, you know, I could potentially be talked out of it, but I think if
Yeah.
you read really carefully in that passage, and I think he's being very subtle and very careful with his language there, I think that's ultimately the sort of details first reading of it that you wind up with a yeah, you have those who are physically uncircumcised and they are regarded as circumcised, but not everybody who's circumcised counts as Jews. You have others who also are included in Israel. And again, we find that out a little bit later.
Right.
So I think there's a little bit of a distinction there. I'm not, you know, I could potentially be talked out of it a little bit. And there, you know, it doesn't really, my larger reading of Romans and of what's going on in the New Testament in general on this isn't really dependent on reading Romans 2 that way because you can
Mm.
have the idea that, well, you know, those who come in are, you know, they may be treated as part of Judah as well, maybe. I
Yeah.
mean, they're in
Yeah.
Christ, who's from Judah as it is. So you could make the case there. But either
Or
way,
that it's a synodoche or something like that.
yeah, you could make a
Yeah.
case there for
Yeah.
that. You could also make the case that that you know essentially Israel is being restored through you know salvation is from the Jews, as Jesus says in John,
Yeah.
because Jesus is from Judah. Therefore, you know, the salvation of the non-Jewish parts of Israel are by their being engrafted into the Jewish Messiah. You know, you
Yes.
could go that far,
Yeah.
but that still doesn't get you the requirement that the non-Jewish part of Israel be restored in some way,
Right.
you know,
Right.
regardless of how that happens. So, you know, that doesn't really impact the larger framework, I don't think.
Yeah. I think that's right. And it does seem to me that even if one wanted to say that there's a sense in which Romans 2 is identifying even Gentiles as, in some sense, inwardly Jews, you could see that as a kind of a synodoche insofar as they are benefiting from the promises given to Judah. But that doesn't necessarily imply that they are actually Jews in the same way that those who actually descend from the southern kingdom are Jews.
Right.
Uh,
Which and he's careful not to actually make that claim, right? He
right,
doesn't say that. And I think that's
right,
on purpose
right.
that he avoids it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting because the closest he gets are things like we are the circumcision, or like a true Jew is one who is inwardly, and will not their uncircumcision be reckoned as circum. But he doesn't ever explicitly say they are therefore Jews,
Right.
which
But
I
he
think is
does, I think, say, I think he gets real close and even to the point where he says all Israel
Yes.
from the
Yeah.
fullness of the nations. The fullness of the nations has to come in, and thus all Israel will be saved.
Right.
He's identifying a part of Israel with the fullness of the nations at that point. Like that's more
Yes.
explicit, and he's willing to make that claim with Israel language, but not so much with Jew language, with
Yeah.
Judah language, which I think
Yeah.
is I think deliberate for him.
I think so, yeah. So talk a little bit about how this impacts sort of political theology. It's funny because, like your book in some ways timely to today's political situation with Israel. And I think so someone might read your book and say, well, this ends up functionally being replacement theology because where you get to is the church is Israel, but the church is Israel restored is would be where you get to. Um,
And the church has to include Judah.
right, and the church include has to include Judah. Um, how would that then change the way we think about the promises given to ethnic Israel and how we think about the nation state of Israel formed in the 1940s?
Well, a couple things. First of all, I mean, again, ethnic Israel is a tricky thing
Yeah,
because,
that's
who
true. Yes,
constitutes ethnic, not just Jews,
you're
right?
right. Yeah,
It never was. Within Jewish theology, it's understood that not just Jews are, ethnic Israel. You still
right.
have the notion of, even within the state of the modern nation state, you have investigations into the B'nai Dan, for example,
Mm,
the sons of Dan who claim to be from descended from the tribe of Dan, and they applied for uh, some of them have applied for citizenship to Israel on that basis, and they've been accepted, even though they're not
interesting.
Jewish, right?
Yeah,
Uh, but they have to kind of become Jewish in order to do this. But there's this understanding that like there might be remnants of these other, like even within Israel today, right? There's
yeah,
this understanding.
yep,
So beyond that, or first of all, that's helpful to understand that we can't just say ethnic Israel mean Jews,
yep, yep.
and that's an important distinction. Now, the other thing that's important here is understanding that when we start to understand what the prophets promise in terms of the restoration of Israel, the final restoration, what God promises to do for Israel and with Israel in terms of redeeming them from the nations and bringing them back to the land and all of these things, those promises apply to Israel, yes. But here's the thing, even within I'll just say, not just even, within standard Orthodox Judaism, the various varieties of Orthodox Judaism, the modern nation state of Israel does not qualify under any circumstance as what is promised
Yeah,
by God as the restored Israel.
yep,
Uh, there,
yeah.
this is one of the reasons why prior to the Holocaust, prior to the Shoah, the majority, and I mean a vast majority, most Orthodox Jews opposed Zionism.
Interesting. Huh.
Now,
Huh.
most Americans and lots of Christians worldwide, especially in the West, are shocked to learn this if they do
Yeah,
learn this. And the thing is, Zionism was a primarily secular, almost exclusively secular movement.
yeah.
So uh, I should go through a little bit of the history of this to explain this, in more modern terms. I mean, the basic idea here is through 1900 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, the default Jewish position was one of essentially quietism, was one
Mm,
of
mm,
be faithful and wait for God to send the Messiah and do what he promised in terms of restoring Israel from the nations. And so when you read like the Amidah, the standard prayer that has been said within Judaism for 2000 years,
mm,
that when you go to the synagogue, you say the Amidah, you have in that prayer, actually more than one, but there's a specific one of the blessings that is an appeal for God to restore the people of Israel scattered across the world
mm,
and to do what he promised in his prophets. And
mm.
there's about 6 or 7 statements that to that effect. But there's one specific appeal or request to God that he does this. And this has been part of religious practice within Judaism for 2,000 years plus.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Hmm.
So here's the thing, you get to the 19th century, and, it's been a rough 1900 years for Jews,
Yeah. Yep.
right? And so you're also getting the secularizing tendencies in Western Europe. You're
Right.
getting a lot of cultural shifts. You get Jewish emancipation that happens. You have a
Yeah.
lot of things that happen around that time. And you have the development of, in the late 19th century, you have the development of Reform Judaism by
Yeah.
about the 60s. You have the development of all sorts of different things that are starting to move away from some of the traditional Orthodox ways of being Jewish, right?
Yeah.
And yes, you've had different kinds, different ways of being Orthodox. I mean, Ashkenazi Judaism within Europe versus, Sephardic Judaism and other things along those lines. There are some differences, but it's still recognizably Orthodox Judaism with, some local and regional differences, and, in the small tradition sense. What happens though, by the time you get to the 19th century, is you start to get ways of being Jewish that don't look like some of the older ways, right?
Hmm.
You have movements that are saying, look, the way we've done it for 2,000 years, like, God ain't sending this. This ain't
Yeah.
happening. So you get
Yep.
the Reform movement, for example, steps in and says, we're not waiting for the Messiah anymore. We're just
Hmm.
not.
Hmm.
We're just not doing that. Instead, we are going to, take off our distinctive dress. We're going to, eliminate lots of the dietary regulations that keep us separated from everybody else. We're still going to have certain ways of worshiping, and we're still going to, be recognizably Jewish, but it's going to be different.
Hmm.
And, within the Reform movement of the late 19th, early 20th century, you have a big emphasis on, Berlin or New York. That is our New Jerusalem.
Hmm.
And it is our job to move to lean into the justice of modernism, of this modern world that we're starting to see prosperity, and we're seeing our own emancipation and all this. And we're going to lean into this,
Hmm.
and this is we're going to bring out the messianic age ourselves in this way. And that's
Hmm.
oversimplified to some degree, but this is basically the way that this works. So that's one avenue of Reform Judaism. You also had a lot of secular Jews who essentially were not practicing religiously at all, who stepped up and said, "Look, we've been waiting for 1900 years for God to move, for God to send the Messiah. Maybe it's time." Look around. We're seeing nation states develop all over the place. You got
Yeah.
the various German states have just unified into Germany. You've
Yeah.
got France just unified it's a century ago or a couple centuries
Yeah.
ago. You have, all these different nation states are developing, and they're looking around and going, guys, this is going to be uncomfortable for us. We need a
Hmm.
place of our own. Like, we need our nation state if this is going to
Hmm.
work. Because there's some bad horizon if we're the outsiders in all of these nation states. Guys, this could get real bad.
Yeah. Hmm.
And a lot of the Orthodox are like, no, no,
Hmm.
we can't do this on our own.
Hmm.
But you had Theodor Herzl and others that argued that Israel that Jews needed to have their own nation state in order to be able to have their own way of self-defense, so that they're not basically at the mercy of wherever they're living.
Hmm.
Now, on the Reform side, they were resisted by the people who said, look, I'm German. I'm a German Jew, but I'm German, and I'm as
Hmm.
German as they are. And I've been emancipated. They're treating me like that. This is my home. I'm not looking for another home. So you had
Hmm.
that on the Reform side. On the Orthodox side, you had, this is blasphemous. This
Hmm.
is sacrilegious. This is the effort to produce out of our own effort what only God could do. And by sending the Messiah, we have to be faithful and wait. And if we go out and we do this, this is going to lead to really bad things.
Hmm.
Turns out the Zionists had a point.
Hmm.
6 million Jews die in the Holocaust, and lots of people are looking at the Zionists who are going,
Yeah.
we
Hmm.
told you, we warned you, the ones who are still alive, we
Yeah.
told you, We warned you. Now, let's get this thing started. Now, many of those Zionists had already actually gone to the land by that point
Mm,
and
mm,
started to, settle in that area or whatever. But eventually they get agreements and you get the formation of a nation state in the traditional region from
yeah.
associated with Jews and with Israel. But and you start to get Orthodox Jews who, for example, say, okay, you had a point about like us needing to do this so that we could survive, but but let's just be clear, this is not the fulfillment of the promise.
Interesting. Huh.
And that's still the default Orthodox position. What you
Huh.
have is at most within Orthodoxy, you have Orthodox Zionists who their view is this is the what's called the flowering of the restoration or the first
Mm,
flowering of the reconciliation. So that it's our job, they say, not to bring about the restoration of Israel, because only God can do that through the Messiah, and that's going to involve the tribes and everything. Instead, it's our job to prepare the soil, to prepare the ground, to prepare the place for the Messiah to return.
mm,
And that's what has happened theologically since the Holocaust
mm.
in that development. But throughout Jewish theology, this is the basic understanding of what the nation is. It is not regarded within typical Jewish theology. It is not regarded as a fulfillment of the promises or the eschatological restored Israel that the prophets promised. It's just
Yeah.
not.
Wow.
And it
Huh.
doesn't fit any of the criteria necessary to be that.
Right.
Instead,
Yeah.
it is a modern secular nation state where Jews can live. It is a state that, it's a Jewish state where Jews can live and defend themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Huh.
And so there's a big difference between those. Now, a lot of
Right.
Americans, a lot of Western Christians have a harder time because first of all, they don't know that.
Yeah.
It would be shocking to most Americans to learn that when they founded the nation state of Israel, it was a surprise. It was not expected that they were going to name it Israel in the first place.
Mm.
The name that everyone presumed that they would name it was Judah or Judea.
I actually didn't know that. Huh.
Yeah. So
Huh.
there were about 5 or 6 names that were under consideration. Judah or Judea, uh, Zion was another one. Herzliya, named after Theodor Herzl,
Mm.
uh, and Evel, which is from the Hebrew word for Hebrew, Evel,
Mm.
Ivli. So those were all on the table as potential names for the state, and there was about a year and a half of debate as this was all kind of getting arranged to try to figure out what they should name the nation state. Ultimately, there were a number of problems that were presented. Okay, well, if you go with Judah or Judea, there's a few issues that come up. Number one is people throughout the world who are Jewish, they call themselves Jews. They're Jewish.
Mm.
And now, if we have a Jewish state and the citizens are Jews or Jewish, how does that differentiate them from like Jews anywhere? That's one
Yeah.
problem. Two, and the bigger problem is that the land that was partitioned in the 1948 agreement doesn't include the bulk of Judah.
Yeah.
So if you're going to
Yep.
name the nation state include most of the traditional land of Judah, that's a bit of a problem.
Yep.
Okay, so they
Yep.
so they threw that one out. Zion was like, well, we don't even control Jerusalem, which is where Zion is.
Right.
Like we can't call this the state of Zion when we don't have Zion.
Right.
Okay, so that's out. Herzliya didn't really gain any traction at all. Evel was like, yeah, that just doesn't roll off the tongue, guys.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
finally, it was David Ben Gurion who, in a meeting of the provisional government, in a cabinet meeting, he put forward we should name it. We should name the state Israel, and we should name
Mm.
it, and the people who are citizens of it should be Israeli, and it should be the state of Israel if we call it state of whatever, and we should talk about the Israeli army, etc. Like we're going to do that, and this is what I put forward, and it was approved by a 7-3 vote.
Mm.
Okay. Now, what's interesting is that it wasn't unanimous,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Now, technically, they didn't count the nay votes. It was one of those of
Interesting.
like, show of hands, and 7 people of the 10 that were present voted yes.
Yeah.
Among those who argued against it, who didn't like it, you had people who said, like, look, this is a problem. Like, we are Jews. We should be calling this the Jewish state, or we should be calling this Judah.
Yeah. Yep.
And Israel is confusing. Like
Mm,
it's the wrong label. So you had people who argued that. One of the
that's
problems is among the Orthodox, you had this whole question of like that makes it like that steps up to the line of making it confusing where it could be taken as implying that this is actually what it isn't.
yeah, like a theological claim about it.
Right.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that was
yeah.
uncomfortable. Now,
Yep.
eventually, everybody sort of embraced it eventually. Now,
Yeah.
there's lots of evidence for this, by the way. I mean, you've got the minutes of different things and reports of the people who were there in the cabinet meeting and all this. But maybe one of the most interesting is you can look this up in the National Archives for the United States. The letter by Harry Truman, the letter recognizing the state of Israel by Harry Truman, which was dated. I'm thinking I've got it here on my computer. Um, there's a recognition of Israel on May 14th, 1948,
Mm,
and it's signed by Harry Truman, and it says, and this is printed, right? So it's printed for him to sign. This government has been informed that a Jewish state has been proclaimed in Palestine, and recognition has been requested by the provision or by the, and then it's added in handwriting, provisional, and then government thereof. The United States recognizes this provisional government as the de facto authority of the new Jewish state.
mm.
And then Jewish state is crossed out, and then handwritten above it is State of Israel.
Interesting.
Because when they wrote that in on May 14th, 1948, and then printed it out, they
Mm.
still didn't know what it was going to be called. And Truman's actually one of his cabinet members who was commented on this said, "Well, we were surprised that it was called Israel. We thought it was going to be called the Jewish state
Huh.
or Judea."
Yeah.
So, that's why that, got crossed out there. But that's a good example of how that worked. Now, I say all of that just to point out that within Judaism, for the founders of Israel, it it was never a question that this was actually the restored Israel, or that this should be identified with the promises to the prophets, or anything like that. That
Yeah.
this is the successor to the heir and successor to Israel in the Bible. It's understood that this is a Jewish state, and
Interesting.
that
Yeah.
that's
Huh.
something that I think Christians should need to understand better. And
Yeah.
and then when we get into Christian theology, if the church is actually the means by which the promises to Israel are fulfilled, which is what we get in the New Testament and Christian theology, then the state of Israel certainly can't be that in the
Right.
same way. So
Yep.
that's out already for Christians in that context. So and that's where the dispensationalist approach is right, in that it recognizes that the replacement theology out of which it itself grew is wrong.
Right.
It's the wrong step
Yep.
in redressing that. And interestingly, dispensationalism develops right around the same time and alongside Zionism,
Yes. Yeah.
in terms of temporally. So anyway, all of that is important for people to understand. And then once you have that understanding, then you get to the question of politically and all this. So, okay, well, then how should this be understood? How should we receive it? Well, I think practically speaking, history shows that the Zionists were right. Right? I
Yeah.
mean, I think we, as Christians, as Americans, as human beings, I think we should be in a position where we need to recognize that there needs to be a Jewish state,
Mm.
and that we should support the continued existence and flourishing of a Jewish state.
Hmm.
I I don't think there's like that's not even a theological, that's not a
Yeah.
theological claim. That's a historical, like, guys,
Yeah. People did
like,
prey on them.
let's
Yeah.
look at Jewish history. Like, do we
Yeah.
do we want continued pogroms? Do we want more Holocaust type stuff? Like,
Right.
we should support that exists, but there should be a careful distinction between what a Jewish state, between the existence and flourishing of a Jewish state, and regarding that as the special people, the special nation of the people of God in some theological sense. Those are
Yep.
different things.
Yep.
And the other thing is, even if it was the true heir and the all of those things in terms of the restored Israel promised in the Bible, that wouldn't mean that there's no room to criticize. I mean, the one thing that we
Yes.
find in the
Yep.
biblical record is the prophets are consistently going to the
Yep.
leadership of Israel and going, that's unjust. You got to fix
Yep.
that. You
Yep.
can't do this.
Yeah.
So, prophetic critique is still there. We still have to hold the government of Israel and ourselves as well, and
Yeah.
first and foremost ourselves, we
Yep.
still have to hold people accountable for doing what's right and and
Right.
and
Yep.
seeking justice. So it sort of puts you in a rock and a hard place situation because you do have people who are dedicating their lives and their groups to the destruction of the nation state of Israel. There's no
Yes.
question about that, and they should be able to
Right.
defend themselves.
Yep.
But that defense also needs to be just. So
Yeah.
that's kind of where I wind up on all that.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I myself did not know Orthodox Judaism does not see that as the fulfillment of the promise to Israel and sees it as a state that ensures their continued existence, but not a fulfillment of the promise. That's
Yeah.
really interesting. And
Messiah has not come.
yes, and that helps reframe the conversation so as to say, maybe at best you could see the Jewish state as a witness in history to God's desire to bring in the southern kingdom to draw them into back into Israel. But you can't see that Jewish state itself as Israel, as at least the Israel of Scripture of
Right.
Romans
There's
9.
Israel and there's Israel and then there's Israel. And it's
Yeah,
like, which one
yeah,
are we
yeah, yeah,
talking
yeah.
about? Right.
Right,
But
right.
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And so you have to make that distinction. And like I said, by and large, and what's interesting is you've had some bleed over from Christian Zionism to bleed
yeah,
over into certain modern Jews who now, some modern Jews actually think of it more like Christian Zionists.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Especially from the reform side, which is really interesting to see that develop.
Yes.
But
Yeah,
by and large, in traditional Jewish theology, and again, you talk to, Orthodox Jews and you say, okay, is Israel the state, where you're living here as an Orthodox Jew, is this the fulfillment of the promises? They go, oh, no, no, no. The Messiah
yeah,
has not yet come. Now it
yeah,
is our job to prepare the way for the Messiah. And, what we're doing here, we hope is a part of that preparation, and we're going to lean into that. That's what you're going to get. And,
yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And that's helpful in thinking about I know it's become and I think rightfully and I think this is a positive development. Instead of speaking of replacement theology, reconfiguration or expansion theology, where Israel is expanded to include the Gentiles, I think your way of articulating that is a more biblically coherent, biblically faithful way of getting at that picture. So that's yeah, that's just really helpful. Well, we're at an hour here, and usually I ask my guests to plug anything that they have going that they want to plug. And so, where can people find your work, and what projects are you currently working on that you would like people to know about?
So I'm not hard to find. In terms of if you use any internet search thing for my name, you'll find me.
Yeah,
But I do some writing at Substack, though it's been a little less frequent than I'd like of late. But that hopefully will pick up here in the near future. And then I'm working on several projects actually. I'm about to sign a contract for a book I'm pretty excited about, but can't really discuss yet until the ink is dry.
cool.
But safe to say that it will have a lot to do with explaining what's going on in Romans,
Yeah,
if that
yeah,
if that makes sense. Um, and then I'm also going to be working on doing a more of a lay version of the Paul and the Resurrection of Israel. So targeted more at my goal is going to be for reasonably interested middle schooler to be able to follow what's going on there in terms of the writing and the kind of argumentation that's done. A little bit less, a good bit less, almost no sort of inter-scholarly discussion or intra-scholarly discussion in there, just more of a straightforward, like, here's what's going on book. looking at getting that done here in the near future. And then the project that I've worked the most on so far this year is actually a book on C.S. Lewis and his use of Christian scripture,
Hmm.
and that I'm hoping to have in the pipeline and ready to publish sometime in 2026, and then probably come out in early 2027. And then I've got several other articles and a few other books in the pipeline beyond that. But those three book projects, and it might end up four because the Paul book may end up being two popular books, one focusing on one thing, one on another. Still working on that with an editor, but that's what I'm working on at present, and then we'll see where that all goes. But yeah, right now, biggest thing is just trying to figure out time to do all these things while still working enough to make enough for my children to eat,
Yeah.
and then also teaching and doing those other things. So as an adjunct, I have to wear a lot of hats in order
Yeah.
to make ends meet, and then I've got two young children that keep me busy otherwise. So I'm just trying to find ways to get all this done. So that's the present thing. But hopefully by about 2027, I'll have three, maybe four things hitting by around then.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And yeah, if you're watching, please do keep Dr. Staples in your prayers to give him wisdom and strength to be able to complete those projects. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'll link your book below, and thank you so much for watching. This has been a joy.
Well, thank you so much for this invitation. It's been a real pleasure.
All right. God bless.